So here's where we found ourselves on the morning of March 20th, 2026, sitting with a strong cup of coffee of the kind that burns the back of your throat and forces your eyes wide open, scrolling through the kind of news that used to appear only in the final chapter of a geopolitical thriller. Except there was nothing fictional about any of it. In less than 72 hours, three of the most powerful figures inside the Islamic Republic of Iran had been systematically removed from the board. Ali Larijani, the man who had spent 5 decades weaving himself into the very fabric of the Iranian state, was gone. Gholamreza Soleimani, commander of the Basij forces, the regime's iron fist of internal control, was gone. And then, within hours, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian stepped to the cameras to confirm what Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz had already claimed. Intelligence Minister Esmail Khatib had also been struck down in the night, 3 senior officials. 48 hours, and the world held its breath, wondering whether it was watching the surgical dismantling of a government or something far more historically complicated, far more ancient, and far more resistant than any strike package could ever address. Because here is the question that nobody in the major Western editorial rooms was asking with the depth it deserved. Can you actually destroy a state by eliminating its leaders? Can a government be hunted out of existence? Or does something else happen entirely, the system adapting, mutating, hardening, and persisting in ways that make the original question look naive? That was the thread we followed, and what we found along the way was, in the truest sense of the word, illuminating. Let's go back for a moment to understand what kind of state we're actually talking about. Because when Washington strategists and Tel Aviv planners sit in their briefing rooms drawing lines through organizational charts, this man eliminated, that man removed, this command structure disrupted, they are operating with a model of governance that is fundamentally Western, fundamentally modern, and fundamentally misapplied to the entity they are attempting to neutralize. Iran is not a corporation. It is not a parliamentary democracy where removing the prime minister triggers a clean election cycle. It is something far older, far stranger, and far more layered. The territory we call Iran sits at the absolute center of what the great British geographer Halford Mackinder called the Heartland, the pivot of history, the geographic zone whose control, he argued in 1904, would determine the fate of the world. Mackinder was thinking about land power versus sea power, continental empires versus maritime ones. He could not have imagined precision-guided munitions over Tehran. But his fundamental insight remains remarkably intact. The heartland does not fall easily. It absorbs pressure, it redirects force, it outlasts its attackers. The Persian state, in one form or another, has existed for more than 2.5 millennia. It was conquered by Alexander the Great. And within a generation, Alexander's successors were adopting Persian administrative structures and Persian court culture because there was simply no other workable model for governing that territory at scale. The Mongols under Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad in 1258, ended the Abbasid Caliphate, and committed one of the most catastrophic acts of urban destruction in human history. Then the Mongol successors converted to Islam, patronized Persian poets, and commissioned Persian miniatures. This is the pattern. This is what the heartland does. It does not simply resist, it metabolizes. Now, understanding that history is not nostalgia. It is absolutely essential operational context for what was unfolding in March of 2026. Because the Israeli and American war planners who designed the sequential targeting of Iranian leadership were making a specific bet, that the Islamic Republic was more brittle than those ancient iterations, that it was held together primarily by the personal authority of a small circle of men, that removing those men would cause the structure to lose coherence, and that from the resulting chaos, something more manageable would emerge. It was, in a very real sense, the same bet placed on Iraq in 2003, the same bet placed on Libya in 2011, the same bet that had informed the entire arc of what scholars now call the Long War. And here, right here, is where this story gets genuinely surprising, because the bet was not entirely wrong, but it was not right in the way the planners imagined. And the difference between those two things was going to determine the shape of the next decade. Let's reconstruct what actually happened chronologically, because the sequence matters enormously. On February 28, 2026, day one, American and Israeli forces launched simultaneous strikes across Iran. In those opening hours, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who had outlasted the Soviet Union, 4 American presidents, and round after round of sanctions and confrontation, was struck down. Within moments of the announcement, a reporter on Iranian state television, covering the mandatory morning rallies, made the kind of slip that tells you everything about the psychological reality beneath the surface of official solidarity. He called out, "Live on air, death to Khamenei," when he had meant to say, following the script of 47 years, death to America. He corrected himself immediately, but those syllables had already traveled through the airwaves and into history. That slip was not just a Freudian accident. It was a seismograph reading of the real Iran underneath the official one. 9 days later, on March 9th, Iran had a new supreme leader. Mojtaba Khamenei, the second son of the man just struck down, was elevated in a process that was neither fully constitutional nor fully transparent. The Assembly of Experts held its sessions virtually under intense pressure from the IRGC, with its QOM headquarters having been bombed in the chaos of the opening days. The Revolutionary Guard needed two things simultaneously: speed and symbolic continuity. What it got was Mojtaba, a mid-level cleric with no published scholarly work, insufficient religious credentials by traditional Shia standards, but decades of deep operational connection to the IRGC command networks, having effectively run his father's office for at least 20 years. He was not the choice of the reformists, who demanded a figure with broader national appeal, but he was the choice of the men with guns. And in a wartime succession, the men with guns win. Now here is the detail that nobody was talking about loudly enough, but that was quietly deciding the entire game. From the moment Mojtaba took the position, there were no verified public appearances, no video, no audio recording of the new supreme leader himself. Iranian state television displayed a still photograph, while a news anchor read a written statement attributed to him. Trump went on Truth Social and said he was hearing that Mojtaba was not alive. Defense Secretary Hegseth said the new leader was wounded and likely disfigured. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi insisted there was no problem. The new supreme leader of the Islamic Republic had issued his first public communication, calling for continued resistance and declaring the Strait of Hormuz a tool of pressure, through a photograph and a voice reading words that may or may not have been his own. This is not normal. This is a state in genuine existential crisis mode, and this is the pivot point around which everything else turns, the state was still functioning. Ali Larijani was, in the weeks between Khamenei Sr.'s elimination and his own, arguably the most important single individual in the Islamic Republic. He was the secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, the pragmatist who knew where the doors were and how to open them. He had spent nearly 5 decades in the innermost circles of Iranian power, IRGC commander in the early years, head of state broadcasting, chief nuclear negotiator, speaker of parliament for 12 years, a record, senior advisor to the supreme leader. When Trump signaled in early March that Iran was talking to his people, the man on the Iranian side of that conversation was Larijani. And in one of his last public statements, he looked directly at the American president and said, "Iran doesn't fear your empty threats. Even those bigger than you couldn't eliminate Iran. Be careful not to get eliminated yourself." On the night of March 17th, Israeli intelligence tracked Larijani to a safe house in the outskirts of eastern Tehran. Not his permanent residence, but one of several prepared emergency locations. 20 one-ton bombs dropped from Israeli Air Force jets. His daughter had been nearby when the building was struck. The man who might have been the bridge between Tehran and a negotiated end to the conflict was removed from the equation within minutes. Former Jordanian ambassador Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein put it plainly the next day. He seemed to be the one person the international community could talk to, and now with him apparently gone, it's difficult to see who speaks for Iran's Revolutionary Guard at any political level. On the same night, in a separate joint American-Israeli operation, the tent encampment outside Tehran, where Gholamreza Soleimani had gathered with senior Basij commanders, was struck. The Basij had been operating out of temporary field installations because their permanent headquarters had been destroyed in earlier strikes. Soleimani had commanded the force for 6 years, years of brutal internal suppression through the crackdowns of 2019, the violence of the 2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising, and the mass arrests at the beginning of this very war. By March 2026, Basij checkpoints lined Tehran's streets, anticipating unrest as bombs fell and the economy buckled. Removing the Basij commander in the middle of an active internal security operation was not just a military strike. It was an attempt to sever the spinal cord of the regime's internal control mechanism, and then, within 24 hours, Esmail Khatib, intelligence minister, struck in an overnight operation in Tehran. President Pezeshkian confirmed it himself, calling it a cowardly assassination and listing all three, Khatib, Larijani, and Defense Minister Aziz Nasirzadeh, removed earlier in the war, together in a single expression of grief. 3 cabinet-level figures. One statement. A president still standing, still speaking, still representing the constitutional surface of a state whose security and intelligence infrastructure had just been comprehensively targeted. The real breaking point in this entire story starts right here, because what came next defied the logic of the targeting campaign entirely. Iran retaliated again. Within hours of the Larijani and Gholamreza Soleimani eliminations being confirmed, Iran launched missile barrages at Israel and at Gulf Arab neighbors. 2 civilians in Ramat Gan, people in their 70s, found just outside their safe room, lost their lives in the response. Iranian state media called the barrage revenge for the blood of martyr Dr. Ali Larijani and his companions. The IRGC command structure, despite losing its Basij chief, its intelligence chief, and its de facto political leader in 48 hours, was still launching coordinated strikes across multiple fronts. The Houthis in Yemen were still active, Iraqi militia networks were still functioning. The resistance axis, whatever its diminished state, had not collapsed. This is the paradox that any serious geopolitical analysis has to confront directly without flinching. History tells us repeatedly and without mercy that decapitation strategies, removing a state's leadership as a primary war-winning mechanism, have a genuinely mixed record. In some cases, they work. But in every case where the targeted organization had deep institutional roots, a replacement ideology, a distributed command structure, and an existential reason to continue fighting, the decapitation proved to be a temporary disruption rather than a terminal blow. Think about the Roman legions in Parthia. The Parthians had governance so decentralized that cutting off the head simply created multiple new centers of resistance. Think about Napoleon's campaigns in Spain. Removing the Bourbon monarchy did not produce grateful subjects. It produced the guerrilla, the original guerrilla war, because the people fighting were not fighting for the king, but for something the king merely symbolized. Think about the Abbasid Caliphate. When the Mongols removed the caliph in 1258, Islamic civilization did not end. The Mamluks stepped in, the Ottomans eventually claimed the caliphate title. The structure redistributed its center of gravity and persisted. Iran's Islamic Republic is not the Abbasid Caliphate, but it shares one crucial structural feature with all of those historical examples. Its legitimacy is not purely personal. It is embedded in an ideology, in a revolutionary mythology, in a security apparatus, and perhaps most importantly, in the simple, brutal fact of external attack. Now, here is something that was being systematically underreported in the daily flood of tactical updates. Something the UN said quietly in a line that should have been the headline everywhere. UN Atomic Energy Chief Rafael Grossi stated plainly that even if Iran's main nuclear facilities were heavily damaged, A war could not entirely eliminate the country's nuclear program, not completely, not permanently. Satellite imagery was already showing tunnel construction activity near Natanz as recently as November 2025, evidence that Iran had been preparing hardened alternative infrastructure for exactly this scenario. The knowledge does not live in a building. It lives in the minds of hundreds of individuals dispersed across a nation of 90 million people. You cannot locate understanding on a targeting map. And this is the detail that nobody was really talking about, but that was quietly deciding everything. Let's zoom out from the operational level and look at the strategic architecture, because what was happening in Tehran in March 2026 connected to something far larger than Iran alone. The Russia-China-Iran alignment, described in Oman's press just this week as a new international alliance and a geopolitical axis that opposes the West, was watching everything. Beijing had been particularly attentive. China imports an enormous percentage of its energy through the Strait of Hormuz, and its effective closure since February 28th had sent shockwaves through the entire Indo-Pacific. Iran was reportedly weighing a proposal that would allow cargoes traded in Chinese yuan to transit through Hormuz, a move that would simultaneously ease pressure on China and strike a direct blow at the petrodollar architecture that Washington has used for 50 years as a primary instrument of global economic leverage. Think about what that meant structurally. The war that was supposed to neutralize Iran was simultaneously creating the conditions for the most significant acceleration of de-dollarization in the history of the post-Bretton Woods financial order. Every day the strait remained contested, every missile that flew, every $1 billion that oil prices climbed, all of it was pushing energy importing nations in Asia toward alternative settlement mechanisms, toward bilateral currency agreements, toward Chinese-built payment infrastructure as an alternative to SWIFT. The very vulnerability that American power was supposed to be demonstrating was, paradoxically, demonstrating a different kind of vulnerability. The fragility of a system too dependent on a single choke point, a single currency, and a single framework of enforcement. Russia was processing this from the vantage point of its own experience with decapitation attempts, economic, political, institutional, that had failed to produce the regime collapse Western planners anticipated. The lesson Moscow read from the Iranian crisis reinforced its own strategic thesis. Ideological states with deep institutional roots are not defeated by removing their leadership. They are transformed, often into something harder and more intransigent than what existed before. Meanwhile, the global South was receiving a secondary signal underneath the official narrative. Not the demonstration of American power Washington imagined, but a quieter message the heartland absorbs and the state persists. Back to the men who were gone and what their going meant or didn't mean. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi gave an interview to Al Jazeera that was, in its composure, one of the more remarkable pieces of political communication to emerge from the crisis. I do not know why the Americans and the Israelis still have not understood this point, he said. The Islamic Republic of Iran has a strong political structure with established political, economic, and social institutions. The presence or absence of a single individual does not affect this structure. He paused. Of course, individuals are influential, and each person plays their role, some better, some worse. But what matters is that the political system in Iran is a very solid structure. Discount for performance, discount for wartime rhetoric, and then look at what remained after the discounting, because there was something genuine there. The IRGC is not a conventional military that can be defeated by conventional metrics of attrition. It is a parallel state within a state, an organization with its own economy, intelligence apparatus, foreign policy networks, media, construction conglomerates, and political faction. The Basij alone, at its peak, enrolled millions of volunteers. Not full-time soldiers, but a distributed network of ideologically committed individuals who could be activated in specific localities for specific purposes. You cannot bomb a network. You can degrade it. You can disrupt specific nodes. But the network itself, as long as there are people willing to join it and a reason for them to do so, reconstitutes. And here is where the domestic dimension becomes as important as the international one. There were two Irans coexisting in March 2026. There was the Iran of the streets where, when the news of Ali Khamenei's elimination broke on February 28th, some people celebrated openly, despite gunfire, despite Basij checkpoints, despite everything. A reporter on state television called out death to Khamenei live on air because the phrase had apparently colonized his subconscious completely. And then there was the other Iran, the Iran that gathered in Tehran squares for the funerals of Larijani and Gholamreza Soleimani, the Iran that had found under bombardment a form of solidarity that transcended its opposition to the regime. Because the paradox of foreign military pressure on an authoritarian state with genuine nationalist sentiment is that it can simultaneously weaken the regime institutionally and strengthen its popular legitimacy through the rally around the flag mechanism. Some Iranians who had marched for Mahsa Amini, who had chanted "Woman, Life, Freedom," found themselves under falling bombs in the deeply uncomfortable position of not wanting their country destroyed from outside, even while they wanted the regime changed from within. That distinction between wanting the regime to end and wanting the country bombed into submission was one that Washington had never seriously grappled with. The hope for a popular revolt and the simultaneous destruction of the country's infrastructure were not a coherent strategy. They were contradictory impulses dressed in the language of intelligence assessment. The targeting campaign had an internal logic: remove the leadership, disrupt command and control, create internal pressure, potentially trigger either a negotiated settlement on American and Israeli terms or a regime collapse that would allow a more compliant successor to emerge. That logic had coherence if you accepted its premises. The problem was that its premises were wrong in three critical ways. First, the replacement problem. Every leader removed was replaced. Khamenei removed, Mojtaba appointed within 9 days, Larijani removed, but there was already a chain of command beneath him. Khatib removed from intelligence, but the Ministry of Intelligence is an institution, not a person. The IRGC does not require any specific individual to function. Its institutional culture, doctrine, finances, networks, none of these lived in the men who were struck down. They lived in the organization itself. Second, the unification problem. Authoritarian states under existential external pressure become more cohesive internally, not less. The factionalism between reformists and hardliners, pragmatists and ideologues, all of that became secondary when bombs were falling on Tehran and the supreme leader's family was struck down on day one. Mojtaba Khamenei's first written statement framed the entire war as an attack on the nation, not just the regime. And for many Iranians, even those with no love for the Islamic Republic, that framing landed. Third, the deepest problem, the one that history keeps trying to communicate and strategists keep refusing to hear, the nuclear knowledge problem. The UN said it clearly: you cannot locate understanding on a targeting map. The program's knowledge was alive in the minds and memories and encrypted files of hundreds of individuals spread across a nation of 90 million people. What the bombing campaign could achieve was enormous disruption, enormous human cost, enormous economic damage. But disruption is not elimination. And confusing those two things was the category error that would define how the history of this conflict was ultimately written. What the United States and Israel demonstrated in March 2026 was that they possessed the capability to reach the highest levels of the Iranian state and remove individuals from the equation at will. The intelligence that led Israeli Air Force jets to a safe house in the outskirts of eastern Tehran was genuinely impressive operational work. The coordinated, simultaneous strikes that removed the Basij commander and a dozen of his senior figures in a single night were genuinely impressive coordination. Nobody seriously disputed the military capability involved. What history was quietly disputing was whether military capability of that order translates into political outcomes of the kind the planners imagined. Because the Islamic Republic, as of day 19, had lost its supreme leader, its security chief, its intelligence minister, its Basij commander, and its defense minister. And it was still launching coordinated strikes across the region, still contesting the Strait of Hormuz, still running internal security through an IRGC that remained a functioning organization, still maintaining relationships with Russia and China as strategic buffers against complete isolation, and still possessing nuclear knowledge that could not be bombed away. Unpopularity and institutional collapse are not the same thing. States that control the means of violence, that have deeply embedded security networks, that can frame external pressure as national aggression requiring national solidarity, and that have sufficient external support from major powers to avoid complete isolation. Such states do not fall simply because their leadership is targeted. They adapt, they mutate. They sometimes become more repressive, not less. And the attempt to destroy them from outside often hands them exactly the nationalist legitimacy they need to survive another decade. Larijani, in one of his last public statements, looked directly at the American president and said, "Even those bigger than you couldn't eliminate Iran." It was a threat. It was rhetoric. It was the kind of statement that sounds like bluster in real time and like prophecy in retrospect. Because what he was describing was not the military capability of the Islamic Republic, which was real but outmatched, but the historical pattern, the pattern of the Heartland, the pattern of a civilization that has absorbed conquerors for 2,500 years and found, every time, a way to persist. So we returned at last to the question with which this analysis began. Can you destroy a state by eliminating its leaders? The answer that history provides, and that March 2026 was in the process of demonstrating once again, is this. You can damage it profoundly, you can create chaos within its command structures, you can remove specific individuals whose knowledge, relationships, and institutional authority were genuinely irreplaceable. You can set back programs and disrupt networks, and create genuine crises of succession and legitimacy. All of those things are real. All of those things have costs for the state being targeted and for the 90 million people living within it who paid the price in oil depots burning over Tehran, universities closed, food supplies disrupted, and more than 3,000 confirmed casualties in 19 days. But the state itself, the idea of the state, the institutional architecture, the ideology, the nuclear knowledge, the resistance networks, the geopolitical alignments, these things are not located in any individual. They are distributed through a system. And systems, particularly systems with deep historical roots, genuine external support from major powers, and an ideology that frames survival as a religious duty, do not dissolve when their leadership is struck. What they do instead is what Iran was doing in March of 2026. They absorb the blow, they replace the fallen, they adapt the command structure, they appeal to national solidarity under foreign bombardment, they keep the missiles flying and the strait contested, and the yuan deals under discussion, and the new supreme leader, visible or not, alive or incapacitated, formally in place as a symbol of institutional continuity. The question that now remained, the question that would define the next months and years of this conflict, whether it ended in negotiation or escalation or some grinding, costly form of neither, was whether Washington and Tel Aviv would learn this time what the historical record was trying to teach. Whether someone in the briefing rooms would look at the fact that 19 days in, with the supreme leader, the security chief, the Basij commander, the intelligence minister, and the defense minister all removed, and Iran was still fighting, and ask the question that should have been asked first. Not, how do we eliminate the next target? But what does it mean that there is always a next target? What does it mean that the list never runs out? What does it mean that a state, even one this damaged, this pressured, this internally divided, refuses to simply stop being a state? That is the question that was sitting in the room on March 20th, 2026, waiting for someone with the courage and the clarity to pick it up. And honestly, that was where we left off for today, because that question, unlike the strikes, unlike the funerals, unlike the retaliation barrages, was not going to resolve in a single news cycle. It was going to be with us for a very long time.